Welcome to the 23rd video on ancient Rome. In this video, we're going to get to the start of the First Punic War. But before we do that, I wanted to take a step back and take a look at what's going on in Sicily before the outbreak of the First Punic War. And there is a lot going on. Specifically, Carthage was fighting the Greek city-states in Sicily over a period of several centuries. And there were 3 wars, and they have collectively been called the Greek-Punic Wars. And they lasted roughly between 600 and 265 BC. Now, as we know, the Phoenicians established some of the first colonies off the coast of Sicily after 900 BC. Eventually, Carthage began to take over these cities after 540 BC. During this time, Greek colonists are beginning to show up on the island of Sicily, and this started around 750 BC. And this, of course, coincides with the Greek Archaic period, which was sort of a renaissance for ancient Greece. They were coming out of the Greek Dark Ages, and of course the Greek polis was invented during this time period. And so the Greeks brought with them not only the Greek polis, but also the phalanx. And this had a huge impact on both Rome and Carthage. Now, there's no evidence to suggest that early on there was a lot of tension between the Greek colonies and Carthage. They coexisted for quite a while in relative peace. And Greek cities began to grow, especially Selinus and Syracuse. Now, the ancient Greeks, when they colonized a particular area, they usually had a specific target in mind. And what they did was they picked a very, very weak city or town. So when they sailed to Sicily, they wouldn't have tried to take over a Phoenician settlement or a Carthaginian settlement. They would have picked a small town that was not affiliated with any empire. And the reason is they didn't want to fight a war. They wanted to establish a colony. And once that colony was established, it would begin trade relations with its mother city, whatever city from Greece dispatched the ship with the Greek colonists in the first place. And that might be Corinth, that might be Athens, it could be any number of cities. And what the Greeks did was they would kill all of the adult men and then take the local women for their brides. So there were usually no women from Greece on these voyages. It was strictly men, and then they would take the native women as their wives. So it was quite brutal. Now, there was a massive Doric expansion going on in the 490s BC. Now, if you watched my series on ancient Greece, you will remember that there were 2 major cultures in ancient Greece. There was the Dorian culture, and that, of course, was associated with the Spartans. And then there was the Ionian wing, and that, of course, was associated with Athens. And so both of those groups of people were populating Sicily, and it was only natural that they would come into conflict. And so initially, Carthage was drawn into some of these conflicts. The first conflict occurred between Segesta and Selinus, and Segesta asked Carthage for help, and they assisted Selinus against some of the Greek city-states in the south. So tensions were on the rise. I guess that's the important concept here. Now, during this time, Carthage was tied up trying to conquer Sardinia. So some of their forces were pinned down in Sardinia, and that allowed the Greeks to expand in Sicily without a lot of Carthaginian interference. But after Sardinia was conquered, Carthage began to focus more and more on Sicily. Now, Dorian cities began to dominate Sicily. They captured Naxos and then Syracuse around 490 BC, so they were on the rise. Now, the Ionian Greeks began to fear the expansion of the Doric Greeks, and they were literally worried about getting blown right off the map. And so Emera, an Ionian city, asked for assistance from Carthage, and that began the First Sicilian War. Carthage agreed, as it did not want to see Sicily under one unified Greek faction. And so Carthage dispatched a massive force to Sicily. But at the Battle of Emera, the Carthaginians were defeated by a Syracusan force in 480 BC. The bitter loss caused severe political repercussions in Carthage itself. And so a republic came to power. And although the king was not deposed completely, he retained very little power. Now, one interesting side note to the First Sicilian War, very little territory actually changed hands. But as I said, it had big-time implications for the political environment in Carthage. Now, the Second Sicilian War occurred between 410 and 340 BC. And once again, Segesta and Selinus were at war. Now this time Carthage refused to help, but Athens came to the assistance of Segesta, and this led to the Athenian expedition in 413 BC. And this turned out to be a total disaster for the Athenians and changed the entire course of the Peloponnesian War in Greece. 3 years later, Carthage re-entered the war and assisted Segesta in defeating Selinus in 410 BC. And they actually succeeded in recapturing several cities. But in 396 BC, a plague broke out that killed thousands of Carthaginian soldiers. Carthage lost many of their Greek gains, but maintained control over western Sicily. After years of back and forth fighting, a treaty was finally signed 70 years later in 340 BC, with Carthage maintaining control of most of her western Sicilian possessions. 25 years later, in 315 BC, they were at it again, and the Third Sicilian War was underway. And it started when Syracuse attacked Messana and then started moving into Carthaginian territory. Carthage responded in full, and by 310 BC had captured most of Sicily and actually laid siege to Syracuse itself. Now, to relieve the pressure, Syracuse landed a force in Africa and laid siege to Carthage. But they were unable to penetrate the Great Wall of Carthage, and eventually the Syracusan force in Africa was driven off of the continent. A treaty was signed in 307 BC, ending the Third Sicilian War, and this left Carthage as the dominant player in Sicily. And as a result of this treaty, they were able to add Messana back as a Carthaginian possession. But, and this was the important point, Syracuse was allowed to remain independent, so Carthage was unable to conquer all of the island. And that is a very, very important point, because had Carthage conquered all of Sicily, this would have made it much more difficult for the Romans to make a landing, because Carthage would have been in control of all of the harbors. And Carthage also suffered another setback a few decades later when a group called the Mamertines seized Messana away from Carthage. And we'll talk about the Mamertines in a few slides. So if you take a look at this map, this represents the land holdings at the start of the First Punic War. And you can see right there the map of Sicily. And critically, as I mentioned, Carthage did not have control of the eastern side of Sicily. The Mamertines, as I said, had seized Messana, and Syracuse was allowed to remain an independent power. Now, of course, we know by this point, Rome dominated almost all of Italy, and Rome began to take a serious look at Sicily, and of course, Carthage viewed Sicily as their own backyard. So the coming Punic Wars would decide the fate of Western civilization. The war started in 264 BC, and it had this curious small trigger involving a group called the Mamertines, and we'll talk about them in the next slide. And so now we get to the start of the First Punic War in 264 BC. And as I mentioned before, the root cause of the First Punic War began with a group called the Mamertines, who were actually a group of Italian mercenaries. Now, as I mentioned before, Carthage received Messana as part of the treaty signed with Syracuse in 307 BC. Now, during the Third Sicilian War, Syracuse was led by a Greek tyrant called Agathocles, and he had originally employed the Mamertines. After his death, the Mamertines had no source of income, and so they captured Messana away from the Carthaginians and held the town for 20 years. But the Mamertines weren't really interested in growing a city in the normal way, in terms of building an agricultural base or a trade base. They made this a raiding base and began to raid other territories around Sicily. This eventually caught the notice of Syracuse, who ironically enough had originally hired them. And eventually Hero II, who took over Syracuse after Agathocles, defeated the Mamertines. And with that defeat, Messana now came under direct threat from Syracuse. And so the Mamertines asked Carthage for help against Syracuse. This action alone prevented the Syracusans from sieging Messana, but now the Mamertines feared Carthage would try to reclaim Messana. And so they turned to Rome for help. Now, this debate was not an easy one for the Romans, and so there was an intense debate in the Roman Senate about what to do. Should they assist the Mamertines or not? And again, there was some serious opposition to this for a couple of reasons. The first reason was that this had previously been a Carthaginian possession, and that Carthage had every right to claim Messana. The other reason was that Rome had primarily been a land army on the Italian peninsula. They had never conducted an overseas war and gone over a body of water to fight another army. And so this was very foreign to them in every sense of the word. But eventually Rome decided to side with the Mamertines, and mainly this was out of fear of Carthage taking control of all of Sicily. And so it was game on for the First Punic War. And so with that, the Carthaginians moved naval forces into the region to prevent a Roman crossing of the straits. So Carthaginian ships were patrolling the waters between Messana and Rhegium to prevent a Roman crossing. Now, Carthage and Syracuse decided to set aside their differences and form an alliance against Rome and the Mamertines. So Carthage would blockade the straits, and Syracuse would block the city by land. But the Romans were able to bust through the Carthaginian blockade and landed at Messana in 264 BC. Now, this was more of an expeditionary force rather than full consular armies. But this was a shocking setback for the Carthaginians because their entire strategy depended on preventing the Romans from making a landing in Sicily. The Roman leading this expeditionary force was Appius Claudius, and he defeated the Syracusans and then the Carthaginians on land, and so Messana was saved from certain destruction. Now, the war really escalated in the following year in 263 BC. The Romans sent 2 consular armies to Sicily, and facing certain annihilation, Syracuse had no alternative but to ally with Rome. And so now Rome had a foothold on the eastern side of the island. And so there would be several major battles fought in Sicily between the Carthaginians and the Romans, and we will get to that in the next video.